Imagine a night somewhere deep in the Russian countryside, 300 years ago. The thermometer, if one had been hanging by the small frosted window, would have read close to -30. The forest beyond the village stands frozen and silent. Wolves move somewhere in the dark, but no one hears them, because the wind has covered every sound with a long, low hiss of snow. Inside one of the small wooden houses, a family of 7 sleeps. The youngest child rests on top of a vast, warm structure that takes up almost a quarter of the room. An older boy lies on a wooden shelf high under the ceiling. The parents are on a bench by the wall, wrapped in sheepskin. The grandmother, the oldest in the house, dozes on the warmest spot of all, the broad clay top of the stove that radiates a soft heat into the dark. Outside, the cold is murderous. Inside, it is gentle, dim, smelling of bread, dried herbs, wood smoke, and animal warmth. 6 months of this. Half a year of frost so deep that nails snap in two and sparrows fall from the sky. And yet, generation after generation, century after century, the peasants of this land carried their families through every winter in a house built entirely of wood, without a single radiator, without a single pipe, without electricity, without any of the things we now consider essential to staying alive when the temperature drops. How did they do it? That is the quiet riddle of the Russian winter, and the answer lies inside the walls of one extraordinary building, the Izba. The Izba was not a humble cottage in the way English or French peasant homes are sometimes imagined. It was a piece of folk engineering refined over 1,000 years. From the days before the reforms of Peter the Great, all the way into the 19th century, the basic design barely changed, because it had already been perfected. The walls were made of horizontal pine or spruce logs, stripped of bark and notched at the corners so that they locked together without a single nail. A skilled carpenter could raise a house with nothing more than an axe. Between the logs, in every long horizontal seam, the builder pressed a thick layer of moss gathered from the forest floor and dried in the summer sun, or sometimes coarse flax tow called paklia. As the logs settled in their first year, the moss compressed into a tight, soft seal. Wind could not pass. Even the bitterest northern gale that scoured the open fields outside found nothing to do against those walls. The house breathed slowly through its wooden pores, but it did not leak. The windows were small, often no larger than a child's face. Glass was expensive and rare for most of these centuries, so the openings were often closed with a stretched bladder of an animal, or thin sheets of mica, or simply a wooden shutter. A small window lets in little light, but it also lets out little heat, and in a country where the sun barely climbs above the trees in January, the trade was worth it. The ceilings inside were low, sometimes so low that a tall man had to bend his head when he stepped through the door. This was deliberate. Heat rises, and the lower the ceiling, the closer that warm air stayed to the bodies of the people below. The floor was made of thick planks, raised slightly above the cold earth on a foundation of stones or lower logs, so that the frost in the ground could not crawl up into the room. And in the middle of this carefully tuned wooden box stood the real hero of the whole story, the Russian stove, the pech. To call the pech a stove is almost a disservice. It was not a stove in the modern sense. It was a small building inside the house. Made of brick where bricks could be afforded, and of packed clay where they could not, the pech could stand as tall as a grown man and stretch wide enough to take up a quarter or even a third of the entire living space. From a modern point of view, it was monstrous, an enormous mass of masonry sitting right in the middle of the family's only room. To the people who lived around it, it was the center of life itself. The principle was beautifully simple. You did not heat the air, you heated the stone, and the stone heated the world around it. A single, thorough firing in the early morning, with a careful load of dry birch or aspen, could warm the brick bodies so deeply that it kept giving off heat for a full day and a full night, sometimes longer. Long after the last embers had turned to ash, the walls of the pesh were still warm to the touch, still pushing a soft, even temperature into every corner of the Izba. This was a quiet, steady, healthy warmth, very different from the dry blaze of an open fireplace. It did not scorch the face. It did not dry out the lungs. It did not crackle and bite. It simply held the house at a livable temperature with a patience that matched the long Russian winter itself. But the pesh was not only a source of heat. It was a stove for cooking, an oven for baking, a dryer for clothes, a bed for the family, a clinic for the sick, a bathhouse, and, for those who believed, the home of the household spirit. Few inventions in human history have packed so many functions into one object. In the morning, before the rest of the family was up, the woman of the house rose first. She raked yesterday's coals, brought in a fresh load of split wood from the cold porch, and laid a careful fire inside the pech. Once the chamber was hot, she swept out the ashes and began to cook. Cast iron pots, called chugunki, were pushed deep into the oven with a long wooden handle named ukvat. Inside that radiant chamber, cabbage soup simmered for hours, buckwheat porridge swelled into a thick, fragrant mass, and round loaves of dark rye bread baked on the bare stone floor of the oven, picking up a faint taste of smoke and a crust that no modern bakery can quite reproduce. The food cooked slowly, gently, almost without the cook's attention. While the petch worked, the woman could spin, mend, tend a child, or rake snow from the porch. A meal that on a Western open hearth would have demanded constant stirring took care of itself in the petch because the heat was even and surrounded the pot on every side. Generations of Russian dishes, the long-cooked stews, the porridges, the baked milk with its caramel skin, the clay pots full of mushrooms and root vegetables, all of them grew naturally from the slow, patient temper of this oven. Above the cooking chamber, on the broad, flat top of the petch, was the lezhanka, a sleeping bench of warm clay. Climb up there in January with frost still clinging to your beard, and you would feel, almost immediately, the cold leaving your bones. The lezhanka was the most prized place in the house. It belonged, by right, to the oldest members of the family, the grandparents, the great-grandmother, those whose aging joints and thin blood needed warmth more than anyone else. To grow old in a Russian village was to earn the long, slow comfort of the top of the stove. Children, too, were drawn to it. They climbed up with apples or with kittens, or curled up there during long fevers, or simply listened from above as their parents talked below. A child raised on top of the petch grew up with the memory of warmth in her very bones, a feeling that, in old age, she would still chase by climbing up there again. A little above the level of the stove, attached to the wall under the ceiling, ran another platform called the palati. This was a wide wooden shelf, often big enough to hold 3 or 4 people, where the rest of the family slept on coldest nights. The warm air of the room rose and gathered up there, near the ceiling, and the palati caught that warmth like a sail catches wind. Children loved the palati for its closeness to the ceiling, for the way it felt like a small private country, for the games of peering down on the adults below. Grandparents on the petch, children on the palati, parents on the wide benches along the wall. The whole family, vertically stacked, sleeping inside a single warm room. And then there is the part of the story that always surprises foreigners. The Russians did not only sleep on the stove, they washed inside it. This sounds impossible until you understand the scale. A real village petch had a firing chamber wide enough and tall enough for a grown person to crawl into. After the morning bake, when the bread was out and the coals had been raked, the inside of the oven was a hot, clean, soot-darkened chamber, holding a deep, dry warmth like a sauna. Many households, especially those too poor or too far from a separate bathhouse, used the petch itself as their bath. The procedure was careful. First, the housewife would pile straw on the floor of the oven so that no one would touch the bare stone. A bucket of water and a bunch of birch twigs, called a venik, were placed inside. A child or a slender adult would crawl in, sit on the straw, and close the iron door partly behind them, leaving a small gap for air. Inside, in the warm darkness, they would pour water on themselves, beat their skin lightly with the venik to bring the blood to the surface, and emerge red and steaming, to be rubbed down with linen by another member of the family. Women in labor were sometimes brought to the pech to give birth, because the heat was steady, the chamber was clean from the fire, and the warmth would meet the newborn the moment it came into the world. The old, weakened by fever, were laid by it for days. Aching backs, chest colds, frostbite, rheumatism in the knees, all the slow wounds of peasant life were brought to the stove the way modern people might bring them to a heating pad or a hot bath. The pech was, in a very real sense, the family doctor. It was also a dryer. Wet mittens and felt boots, called valenki, were placed on the leżanka, or hung from racks above the stove to dry overnight. Strings of mushrooms and apples, baskets of herbs gathered in the summer, the precious harvest of the forest, were laid out near the warm masonry until they were dry enough to store for the winter. The smell of an Izba in deep winter was a unique perfume of fresh bread, drying mushrooms, wood smoke, and the faint resin of warm pine logs. For all its gentleness, the pech could be deadly if mishandled. Wood smoke escaping from a poorly drafted chimney was not the worst danger. The real killer was odorless. When the fire had burned down and the homeowner closed the flue, called the vyushka, to stop the precious warmth from escaping up the chimney, the timing had to be exact. Close it too early while the embers were still alive, and carbon monoxide would build up silently in the room. Whole families were sometimes found in the morning, asleep forever, never having woken up, killed by their own stove. The Russian word for this kind of death, ugar, became a household fear. Mothers taught their daughters how to read the color of the coals, when to slide the vyushka shut, and when to wait. A misjudged moment over the embers could undo every careful breath the house was meant to provide. Wood itself was a precious resource. Even in a country of endless forest, fuel had to be gathered, dried, chopped, and stored, and a careless winter could burn through a year of work. Birch was prized because it gave a hot, even flame and a beautiful blue ember. Aspen was used to scorch off chimney creosote. Pine and spruce were burned with caution because their resin coated the flue. Wood piles, called drova, stood neatly stacked in the yard, often under a small roof, sometimes higher than a man, the family's true wealth alongside the grain. Around the warm body of the pech, the rest of the izba arranged itself like rooms around a heart. Beyond the inner door of the main room lay the seni, a kind of cold, timbre-like vestibule, an unheated corridor that separated the living space from the outside world. The seni was a thermal buffer. When the master of the house came in from the freezing yard, he stepped first into this cold porch, stamped the snow off his felt boots, knocked the icicles from his beard, hung up his sheepskin coat called a tulup, and only then opened the inner door. In this way, the deep cold of the outside never entered the warm room in a single shock. The seni breathed for the house, took the cold blow on its own shoulders, and let only a small, polite gust of winter air into the kitchen. The seni was also a storeroom. Along its walls hung tools, harness, dried fish in winter. Sacks of grain were stacked in the corners. Hams and salted meats were sometimes hung from the rafters. The whole structure acted as a pantry that stayed naturally refrigerated through the long, cold months. Beyond or beside the seni often stood the klet, an unheated wooden chamber used as the household's main storage. Here the family kept its grain in tall wooden bins, its summer clothes in chests of carved pine, its tools and harnesses, its small treasures of cloth and embroidered shirts, the dowry of the daughters, the iron of the father, the spindle of the grandmother. In summer, the clet was cool and dry. In winter, it was bitterly cold, which preserved everything inside it almost like a deep freezer. Bread baked in October could still be eaten in January, kept in the clet, sliced and softened over the warm body of the petch before it reached the table. In front of the seni, facing the street or the yard, was the krilcho, the porch. Sometimes it was no more than a simple platform of planks under a small slanted roof. Sometimes, in richer houses, it was an elaborate carved structure with turned columns and lace-like wooden trim painted by craftsmen who took as much pride in their work as any cathedral builder. The krilko was the threshold between the wide, cold world and the warm, secret world of the home. A guest who climbed those stairs knew that he was about to leave the open air behind and step into the slow, patient warmth of another family's life. In many villages, especially in the north, the Izba did not stand alone. It was joined under one long roof with the family's barn, called a dvor. Horses, cows, sheep, sometimes goats, were stabled directly against the wall of the living quarters, separated only by a partition of thick logs. The animals brought their own gentle warmth into the building. A single cow gives off as much heat as a small stove. Several animals together could warm a stable to a temperature that, on the coldest nights, would have killed an unprotected human, but to the cattle felt like home. This was not a sign of poverty or of dirt. It was a deeply practical arrangement. The body heat of the livestock helped the family by warming the shared wall. The closeness of the family helped the livestock by extending the human watch over them through the long nights. If a calf was born in February, it was born within 20 steps of the warm petch and could be brought into the seni or even the kitchen to recover. If a wolf prowled at night, the dog barking from inside the joined building would wake the master immediately, and a single door separated him from the threatened animals. In the south, where winters were milder, this fusion was less common, and the barn often stood as a separate building. But in the dense forests of the north, where snow lay deep from October to April, the joined house was a small fortress of warmth, family, and livestock, all of them surviving the season together. By late afternoon, the brief winter sun was already low, and the inside of the Izba grew dim. To work after dark, the family lit the only light source they had, the luchina. A luchina was nothing more than a long, thin sliver of split pine, often soaked in advance to slow its burning, then placed at an angle in a small iron holder called a svetets. The svetets stood in a wooden trough of water that would catch any falling sparks and prevent the house from burning down. The luchina gave a small, warm, restless light. It flickered, smoked, and had to be replaced every quarter of an hour or so. The children of the house were often given the duty of tending the splinters, swapping a new one in when the old one had burned to its end. Around the luchina, the women spun thread, mended sheepskins, embroidered the long bands of red and black geometry that decorated their shirts. Men braided ropes of linden bark, mended harnesses, repaired the heads of axes. Old men carved wooden spoons. Old women told stories. We have to imagine an evening lit not by a steady bulb, not by candles, not by oil lamps, but by a single trembling splinter of resinous pine, throwing slow shadows on log walls darkened by decades of smoke. The whole atmosphere of a Russian winter night, the long shared darkness, the closeness of bodies, the smell of warm bread and tar, the constant low murmur of voices, was shaped by this small flame. Candles existed, of course, but they were expensive, used mostly in churches and on feast days. Tallow was costly because fat was food. So for most of winter, for most of the year, for most of Russian history, light meant luchina. A long woman's evening, when she would sit until late at her spindle, was called a posidelka. a sitting together, named after the very act of leaning toward that little flame in company. Light was also part of the careful economy of warmth. The fewer windows you cut, the less heat escaped. The fewer doors you opened, the less cold blew in. A peasant woman who left the door open too long while bringing in firewood was reminded sharply by her mother-in-law. Children were taught from their first steps that the cold beyond the threshold was a hungry thing, and that it would slip into any opening it found. The walls themselves were watched and tended. Moss had to be checked every autumn, and any gap stuffed again. The doors were lined with felt or sheepskin to soften the seal. The wooden shutters were closed at night against the wind. Even the keyhole was sometimes plugged with a rag. The Izba was, in effect, a wooden thermos with a single, quietly burning brick stove at its center, surrounded by a household whose every habit was tuned to keep that heat inside. Food during the long winter came from the year that had passed. The cellar, called the pogreb, was dug below the floor or under the seni and reached by a wooden trapdoor. Its earthen walls held a steady, cool temperature, far above freezing but far below summer heat. In autumn, the family filled it with everything they had grown and gathered: heads of cabbage fermented into sauerkraut in tall wooden barrels with rye flour, dill seed, and sometimes cranberries to deepen the flavor. Cucumbers brined with garlic and oak leaves so that they remained crisp even in March. Apples preserved in barrels of water. Wild mushrooms salted in wooden tubs, layer upon layer, with dill and currant leaves between them. Berries, blueberries, lingonberries, cranberries, kept in jars or simply frozen in clay pots in the cold clet. In the rafters above the pesh hung garlands of dried mushrooms, threaded on linen string and turned dark and leathery by months of warmth. Bunches of herbs, gathered on summer evenings and tied at the stem, perfumed the upper air of the room. In a small carved box near the holy corner, the housewife might keep her precious sugar or her dried fruit, brought back from a fair in town. The everyday menu of the village in winter was simple, but never poor in flavor. Black bread, baked once or twice a week in the pesh, dense and slightly sour from a wild rye starter. Cabbage soup, called shi, made of sauerkraut and onions, and sometimes a small piece of pork or beef bone, simmered for hours in a clay pot. Kasha, porridge of buckwheat, millet, or barley, eaten with butter or with hemp oil. Boiled turnips before the potato age, and later boiled potatoes when those arrived in Russian villages. Pies, called pierogi, stuffed with cabbage, mushrooms, or fish, baked on iron sheets in the oven. Salted fish in regions near rivers and lakes. Meat was rare except at certain feasts, because animals were too valuable to eat freely, and because the Orthodox calendar imposed long stretches of fasting that the village kept seriously. In Lent, no meat, no eggs, no butter passed the lips of the family. The cellar's supplies of mushrooms, cabbage, and grain carried them through, with kisel, a thick, sweet drink made from oat or berry, as a comfort. By March, even the best-stocked cellar began to empty. This was the lean time, the hungry weeks before the first green shoots appeared. Russians called it the golodnaya pora, the hungry season. Soups thinned, bread was stretched with bran or even chaff, the children's faces grew narrower, and the family looked out the small window for the first sign of melt. The pech still warmed them, the walls still held, but the cellar whispered its emptiness. Spring was needed, urgently, like medicine. In the warm, dim interior, while the wind howled outside, the long evenings became something of an art. Work never stopped. Winter, for a peasant family, was not a holiday. It was the season of indoor labor, the season when the work that summer made impossible was finally caught up. The women spun flax and wool into thread, then wove that thread into linen and woolen cloth on heavy wooden looms set up against the wall. Every shirt, every towel, every sheet, every dishcloth in that family began its life on a winter evening, in firelight, between the hands of a woman who would never see it called craftsmanship, because to her it was simply work. The patterns she embroidered were not chosen at random. The red diamonds and crosses and birds had ancient meanings of fertility, protection, sun, and water. Her hands carried symbols older than the village itself. The men carved and mended. They wove lapti, simple shoes of woven linden bark that wore out quickly and had to be made by the dozen. They repaired sledges and runners, sharpened the iron of plowshares, twisted ropes, cut new axe handles, shaped wooden bowls and spoons on a homemade lathe driven by a foot treadle. Some, with a special talent, carved the painted spoons and toys for which Russian craftsmen would later become famous. Boys learned from fathers, girls from mothers. There was no school in most villages, no clock, no printed book. Knowledge passed from hand to eye to hand. By the time a girl was 12, she could spin, weave, bake, brine cabbage, milk a cow, deliver a calf if she had to, and walk 3 miles through deep snow to fetch water from a frozen river. By the time a boy was 12, he could harness a horse, swing a real axe, repair a roof, set a beaver trap, and read the tracks of any animal in the snow. And around all of this work flowed sound. Songs at the spinning, half spoken and half hummed. The voice of the eldest reading aloud from the only book in the house, often a worn psalter. The endless quiet conversation between sisters, between brothers, between husband and wife. Long stories told by the old, sitting on top of the peck, looking down at the children who had stopped working to listen. The Russian fairy tale was not invented in print. It was hatched in these winter evenings, in the warmth of the Lezhanka, in the half-darkness of the Luchina. Stories of Baba Yaga in her hut on chicken legs, of the firebird, of Ivan the Fool, of the wolf that was wiser than the prince. Each generation reshaped them, and each evening they were told again. To grow up Russian in a village was to absorb an entire mythology not by reading, but by listening, while one's own hands twisted thread or carved a spoon. Above all of this human life, in the corner of the Izba opposite the peck, hung the silent center of the family's spirit, the Krasny Ugol, the red or beautiful corner. The word krasny in Old Russian did not only mean red, it also meant beautiful, the most honored thing in the room. There, on a small shelf draped with an embroidered cloth, stood the family's icons, blackened by smoke, worn smooth at the edges by generations of touching, often a Mother of God in deep red and gold, a Saint Nikolai, a household saint chosen by the family. A small oil lamp, called a lampada, might burn there on holy days, its tiny flame trembling against the dark wood. Every important moment of the household happened under the icons of the Krasny Ugol. A newly arrived guest crossed himself first toward the corner, then greeted the host. A betrothed couple stood there to receive their parents' blessing. A dying old man asked to be turned so that his face was toward those icons. Babies were laid for a moment in front of them. Meals began with a brief glance and a sign of the cross in their direction. Whatever else was happening in the room, the Krasny Ugol held the moral compass of the family. In a culture often misread as either rigidly religious or rigidly pagan, the truth of village life was a calm, deep weaving of both. The Christianity of the family was real, daily, and unself-conscious. The folk beliefs were also real, also daily, also unself-conscious. The two lived together inside the same Izba, in the same way that the icon and the household spirit lived in different corners of the same room. That household spirit was the domovoi, the master of the house. In the imagination of the village, he was a small, hairy old man with shining eyes, who lived behind or under the pech and who watched over the family. The domovoi was not worshipped. He was not a god. He was a member of the household, in the sense that a long-lived dog or an old grandfather might be. He approved of order, of food left out for him at night in a small dish, of respect shown to the elders and to the corners of the house. He disapproved of cruelty to animals, of quarrels, of moving from the home without bringing him along in a felt boot or an ember from the petch. If the milk soured for no reason, if a horse was found in the morning sweating and exhausted as if it had been ridden in the night, if knocking sounds came from the corner where no one stood, the family would shake their heads and say that the domovoi was unhappy or excited or curious. If a young bride entered her husband's house for the first time, she was led to the corner of the petch and asked, gently, to introduce herself to the domovoi so that he would accept her as his own. None of this was felt as superstition by the people who lived it. It was simply the texture of life. The petch kept the family warm. The icons kept the family blessed. The domovoi kept the family safe in small daily ways, and together these three made the house a home. It is important to keep the lines clear between fact and folk belief. There really were icons in the corner. There really was a stove that took up a quarter of the room. There really was a draft from the cold porch. The domovoi was not real in the way the petch was real, but the belief in him was real, and that belief shaped behavior. People kept their houses clean, partly because they did not want the domovoi to be unhappy. People treated their grandmothers well, partly because the old ones were considered to be closer to the unseen world. The supernatural and the practical were threaded together so finely that no peasant himself bothered to separate them. So here, then, is the picture of a winter night in the Izba in full. Outside, the temperature has fallen to 25, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below zero. The snow lies higher than the roof of the storage barn. Wolves cry far away. The forest groans under its weight of frost. There is no road, no light, no other house within sight of this small wooden box of life. Inside, by the slow flame of a single lucina, a woman is spinning. Her husband is splicing a rope. A child is leaning against the warm side of the petch with her eyes closed. The grandmother is dozing on top of the stove, lit faintly by the lampada that flickers under the icons. The cow shifts gently in the devor on the other side of the partition. A pot of cabbage soup whispers from the oven, waiting for the supper hour. A dog scratches at the threshold of the seni. Smoke from the petch rises straight up, mingles with the steam of drying mittens, drifts past the palati, where the older children pretend to sleep so they can listen to the adults, and finally finds its way out through a carefully drafted chimney whose vyushka the housewife will close at exactly the right moment when the last coal has lost its blue. 6 months of this, half a year, every year, century after century. The peasants of Russia did not merely survive the winter, they built a way of life around it. They turned the longest, coldest, darkest season of the northern world into a time of work, of story, of family closeness, of patient warmth. The Izba itself was their masterpiece. Built without architects, without printed plans, without machines, it solved the problem of winter with a brilliance that modern engineers, looking back, can only admire. The choice of logs and moss, the low ceiling, the small windows, the cold porch, the unheated clet, the shared wall with the livestock, the vast, slow stove at the center, the palati under the ceiling. Every element worked with every other element. Nothing was decorative without also being practical. Nothing was practical without also being beautiful in the eyes of those who lived there. To enter a real Izba in deep January, to step from the brutal silver world of a 30 below morning into that warm, dim interior, was to feel something that no thermostat can give. It was to feel an entire civilization holding off the cold with nothing but wood, clay, fire, patience, and love. The peasants who built and rebuilt these houses century after century did not write books about what they had done. They did not think of themselves as engineers or as inventors. They thought of themselves as ordinary people doing what ordinary people do. They handed down to their children the shape of the corner notch, the right thickness of moss in the seam, the exact moment to close the vyushka, the proper words to greet the domovoi, the songs to sing while spinning. They asked only that the winter be survived once more, and that the spring come again, as it always did. And the spring did come. In April, the icicles fell from the eaves. The river broke open with a sound like a great chest opening. The first warm rain washed the soot from the small windows. The animals were led out of the Dvor blinking into the light. The Lucina was put away. The pech, while still used, was no longer needed for warmth, only for bread. Then, in the long evenings of summer, the family slept outdoors or in the cool seni, and the great clay heart of the house cooled at last, resting, preparing itself silently for the next winter that, in this country, was always only a few months away. That, in the end, is the quiet greatness of the Russian Izba. Not a monument, not a palace, just a small wooden house in the middle of an enormous cold country, glowing softly from inside, holding a family, keeping a story alive, breathing slowly in the dark while the snow piled up to the windows. A house that knew, better than any of us today, how to survive the winter.